Hello and welcome to Season 2 of the Pitch Masters podcast with me, your host, Danny Fontaine. Now, it's been a little while since I released an episode, over a year and a half, in fact, but I needed that time because I've been under a rock writing a book, obviously about pitching. It's called Pitch: How to Captivate and Convince Any Audience on the Planet. It'll be out in June the 5th, 2025. But it is also available to pre-order now from all major bookstores and, of course, Amazon. And there is an audiobook too, so if you're interested, you can also find my behind-the-scenes diary of me recording that audiobook on social media. Just search for Pitch Guy. Now, last season, I had a ton of incredible guests: Rory Sutherland, Nancy Duarte, Oren Klaff, Thomas Erickson, Jeb Blunt, Peter Cowter, just to name a few. And this season, I am so excited to bring you even more of my personal pitching heroes, the people who unknowingly taught me everything that I know. And one of those heroes is Daniel H. Pink. So when I first started out in the world of pitching, I was terrible. It was not a career that I'd ever imagined for myself. And like many people, I had this perception of sales as something manipulative, disingenuous, the classic used car salesman trope, full of slick tricks and empty charm. Luckily for me, I stumbled on a book that changed everything, and that book is To Sell is Human by Daniel H. Pink. This book reframes sales, not as something pushy and performative, but as something deeply human. And when I had the idea for Pitch Masters, Dan Pink was literally at the very top of my dream guest list. It's taken me a few years to get him on here, but I think you're going to really enjoy our conversation. One of the questions I get asked the most is, how do I, little me, with no huge following or global presence, manage to get these kinds of guests to say yes to come on to the show? And in this episode, for the first time, I've put that question directly to Daniel Pink. Why did you say yes? And I'm really hoping that his answer might be helpful to a few people out there. So anyway, I'll stop chatting, but I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone listening. It is actually a lot of work having a podcast, but the fact that you're here makes it all worthwhile. So, sit back, relax, grab a drink, and get ready to take some notes. Daniel Pink, what an absolute honor to have you on the podcast. I really appreciate your time. Now, rather than me introduce you, I think one of the important things about pitching is how we introduce ourselves. So for those people who might not know you, how do you introduce Daniel Pink?
Nothing too elaborate. I just introduced myself as a writer based in Washington, D.C.
That is a very humble introduction.
Yeah. I've been, for the last 20 years, I've been writing books, many of which use large bodies of science to try to find some nuggets and some guidance on how we can work smarter and live better. Is that better?
Hey, I'm not judging either way, but I know for a fact that is true because I think I've read all of your books, and a lot of them have literally changed my life, one in particular. But I'm going to come on to that shortly because I just want to start by hearing a little bit about your career trajectory, because one of the things that I find really interesting is that you studied law at Yale.
Yeah.
And then not long afterwards, you became Al Gore's chief speechwriter.
Correct.
How do you even make the jump from degree student in law to that? How did it happen?
Like most things in life, it happened in an unplanned and largely half-assed way. So I went to university. Here in the United States, law is actually a graduate degree. So you go to university and then you get a law degree as a graduate, a professional degree. So I went to university. Actually, in university, I majored in linguistics. That was my concentration, the sort of the study of language and all of its facets. I went to law school because I didn't have anything better to do, because it was something that middle-class people in America do because they were worried about having economic security. I realized that I didn't want to practice law, and at the time I was keenly interested in politics, and so I just decided to go work in politics. And I became a speechwriter largely because at some point, somewhere along the way, in a frenzy, some boss turned and said, "Can you write a speech?" And of course, my answer was, which is the answer that I want young people to give, is yes.
Right.
And so I did that, and then it was okay, and then I did another one, and then suddenly I was a speechwriter, and so that's what I did for several years in my misspent youth. And then I decided that I didn't want to work in politics any longer. And then what I really wanted to do, that I was a writer deep down, but I wasn't a speech writer. I wanted to write my own stuff. And so that was 25 years ago or so.
And so how do you think you were so good at speech writing? Just to stick with that for a second, because at that early age, were you looking at researching into different frameworks for speeches, or is it something that just came naturally to you?
That's an interesting question. I didn't go into any kind of frameworks about that. I think it was mostly through osmosis, and that I was actually, as I mentioned before, deeply interested in politics at the time. So I was paying attention to what politicians were saying, how they were saying it, and I think just through osmosis, I picked it up. I mean, I think that one of the, for anybody who's anybody who's an okay writer is probably an avid reader. And I was always an avid reader, and I think that helped out quite a bit on that front.
And who do you think is the best of all time at speeches and politics?
Oh my Lord, I don't know. I mean, I think what's interesting about that question is that that the best speeches, certainly political, meet that particular moment. And so that kind of speech, which might meet the moment at time one, might be completely, off for a different kind of time. So, if you think about like Winston Churchill's speeches, like if he gave them today, I mean, it'd be a joke almost. I mean, the way that it sounds and so forth.
Get cancelled, I think.
Yeah, so I think it's really a lot of what makes a speech memorable, especially in politics, is the moment and meeting that moment. So I mean, I've always thought that here in America that Bill Clinton was an incredible communicator. I mean, he had other kinds of weaknesses that ended up bringing him down. But I always thought Bill Clinton was, and I still do, think that he's an incredible communicator.
Yeah. And what do you think the balance is between being truly vulnerable and sharing your inner self in a speech with saying the things that you think will be great for people to hear, that they want to hear? Is that a funny question, maybe? But
it's an interesting question. I think it's a smart question, and the answer, in my view, is that it depends, and it depends on the moment. I mean, there's a big difference between giving a campaign rally speech and giving a eulogy, for instance. So it really depends. A lot of it depends on the circumstances, and I think that's. I mean, I think what you're surfacing here is how much a speech is not a self-contained work, but something that exists in a context, in a situation, and that not only exists in that context and situation, but interacts with it, and that the situation interacts back into the speech. And so it's this dynamic moment that it's different from, say, maybe you writing a short story.
Right. I think it's interesting because I think so. This show is about pitching, right?
Right.
But I learned from you that pitching sales is everywhere. So, I've been trying to talk to you for a while, right? You really were one of the first people I read, especially when I got into sales. So I got into sales in 2013, and this is a year after, I think, To Sell Is Human came out. And I was trying it, and I was thinking, well, I feel like a used car salesman. I feel like I'm manipulating people. I feel like I've got to lie to people. And I was terrible at sales, and I felt like a terrible person. But it was your book that really changed that. So talk to me a little bit, for those people that haven't read it, about this idea of we're all in sales.
Yeah, I mean, your sentiment is fairly widely held, and it's very understandable. That's the other thing. There's nothing wrong with it. You're not wrong. So let me give you two ways at that. So how we're all in sales. If you look, one of the things that got me into this topic of sales was what I perceived as a gap between people's job descriptions and what they actually did all day. I mean, I always felt like you read a job description, you read your own job description, and then you look at what you do, and it's different. Right. It's not anything nefarious about it. It's just that it doesn't capture it fully. And I had an instinct, an intuition, a hypothesis, call it whatever you guess, call it whatever you will, that a lot of what people were doing day to day was a form of sales. Now, they weren't necessarily trying to sell a used car, or they weren't necessarily trying to sell a complex computer system, but what they were doing was trying to get people to work on their team rather than another team. They were trying to get their boss to stop doing something stupid. If they had people reporting to them, they were trying to get those employees to do something different or do something in a different way. And so we did a big survey of the U.S. and Canadian population, the U.S. and Canadian workforce, very, very large sample. And just to ask the question, without using the word sales, saying, how much of your time do you spend persuading or influencing someone to give up something they value for something you have? So basically describing sales, but not using the S word. And what we found in this very large sample is people spending an average of about 40% of their time doing this kind of thing. And for most people, that isn't in their job description. And yet, when you think about 40% of your time, 40% of an hour is 24 minutes. Right. So 24 minutes every hour, every day doing this thing. So if you look at the guts of what especially white collar workers are doing on the job, a lot of it is a form of sales, influencing, persuading, moving people. OK, that's one point. Now, the second point is more connected to what you're saying, your reaction to actually being in a sales job.
Right.
And a lot of people don't like if I say to people, you're in sales, whether you like it or not. Many people will respond, I don't like that.
Right.
For precisely the reasons you're suggesting. And I think that's a mistake. It's understandable, but it's a mistake. And to me, that kind of instinctual disdain for sales is not about sales, but it's about information. Because most of what we have learned, most of our muscle memory about sales has come from a world of information asymmetry. And what I mean by that is that for most of commerce, the seller had more information than the buyer, which meant the seller could rip you off. This is why we have encoded in our laws, encoded in our customs of commerce all around the world, the principle of caveat emptor, buyer beware, because sellers had an advantage, and that's the way that it was. And so we were used to being buyers in a world of information asymmetry, which means that we were skittish about trusting these sleazebags who were selling us stuff, right? But here's the thing. We don't live in a world of information. We live in less and less a world of information asymmetry today. It's much more a world of information parity. And it's happened only in the last, basically the world was one way for a few thousand years, and it changed radically over the last 15 years. Yeah. And so that's hard for us to get used to. And so right now you're not going to be effective in sales or persuasion today, or you're going to be woefully less effective if you lying, deceitful, pushy, taking the low road, because the low road is often blocked off. And so to make this long-winded tirade a little bit crisper, what you have here is a world where gone from a world where buyers had not much information, not many choices, and no way to talk back. That's one world. To the world today where buyers have lots of choices, as much information as the sellers in many circumstances. And this is important, all kinds of ways to talk back. So the argument, as you know, but for your listeners, is that we've moved from a world of buyer beware to a world of seller beware. And that requires a very different suite of personal qualities and particular skills.
So talk me through of those, because I think it's really interesting, and it really empowers the buyer. But for people in sales who go, right, well, now I feel like I'm the underdog, even though people always need to buy things, what am I going to do with these insights, assuming I'm going to take them to heart and take the high road, not the low road, and change myself as a salesperson for the benefit of the buyer? Where do I start?
Yeah, well, first of all, the reason not to take the low road, the reason to take the high road instead of the low road is, first of all, A, it's the right thing to do. B, the low road's not going to work very well because of these changes. So you can make a moral argument, you can make a pragmatic argument. So let's make both. And so it begins almost at a certain set of tiers. And so what I did based on this argument essentially is I said, well, what does the science tell us about how to do this persuading, influencing, convincing, cajoling, moving people effectively and ethically in a world that has been remade by changes in information? And of course, there's nobody is out there doing academic research. How can I persuade in a world of information parity? But that's the bad news. The good news is that there are scholars all over who have been asking smaller questions, who've been pushing back on, or at least scrutinizing, certain precepts that we tend to believe about sales and persuasion. So, are strong extroverts really better at sales than strong introverts? We've been told that we should mimic people when we try to build affinity with them and sell to them. Is that actually accurate? Are women more effective than men? Are men more effective than women? If you're trying to make a case for something, how many claims should you use? How many is too few? How many is too many? If you have an offering and it has a blemish to it, if it's otherwise strong, do you reveal that blemish? Do you try to like hope that it doesn't come up? All kinds of sort of micro questions. And I felt if I went wide enough and deep enough into this research, I could piece together the ways to do this more effectively. And as luck would have it, just give you the top level thing here. When we talk about tiers, it turns out that in my analysis, there are essentially three key qualities that are necessary to flourish in this remade world. So if we're saying we're all in sales, whether we like it or not, but sales is different because of the changes in information, it turns out there are some qualities that seem to be the most important. And as luck would have it, they begin with A, B, and C, just pure, unadulterated luck. So one of them is attunement. So attunement is perspective taking. Can you get out of your own head, see things from someone else's point of view? It is something that is fundamental in sales. It's fundamental in leadership. It's fundamental in having good relationships. It's also something that we're not natively that great at. So that's attunement. The second one is buoyancy. And I came up with this concept of buoyancy from talking to a salesperson he happened to be in San Francisco. He was a brush salesman. He was selling brushes door to door in the business district of San Francisco. And he said, you don't understand how hard my job is. He said, every day I face an ocean of rejection. And so anybody in sales knows this, that you get rejected all the time. And as human beings, we don't like rejection. And a lot of us actually will go to incredible lengths to avoid that. And so buoyancy is, how do you stay afloat in that ocean of rejection? And there's some interesting science behind there. And then finally is clarity. And to me, clarity has two dimensions to it. One of them is that in the old days, the days that we were just describing, that you had an edge as a seller if you had access to information, if you had access to information that nobody else had. At some level, that was part, maybe a central part of the definition of expertise. So I'm a lawyer and I have access to legal information that you don't have. I'm a doctor and I have access to information that you don't have. But now that privileged access to information is disappearing. Like, a lot of people have access to the information. And so the advantage doesn't come from having access to the information, but actually from a more sophisticated skill, which is curating information. Can you make sense of that information? Separate out the signal from the noise in that information. And then the second facet of clarity, which I think is interesting and becoming more and more valuable in a world of AI, is a move, I think, throughout white collar work from problem solving to problem finding. So if you are in a sales situation where your customer, your prospect knows precisely what its problem is, they don't need you very much. They really don't. Where they need you more is when you have the genuine expertise to say, you know what, I'm not sure that's really your problem. I think your problem is something that you haven't seen. So can you surface latent problems? Can you look down the road and anticipate problems? And so these three qualities, attunement, buoyancy, and clarity, in my view, seem to be the qualities that are most necessary in this new remade landscape.
And do you have any thoughts of putting that into more tangible, actionable terms? So if I said to you, well, I don't know whether you actually pitch anything yourself. I know you present a lot. I don't know whether you pitch. That's something I'm keen to know. So when you pitch something, do you have like a set of a formula, if you like, that you run through every time that you know works for you that touches on the ABC?
No, not on that. I think what's important is I think that it's almost like there are particular kinds of pitches that I have studied and that I will use myself. So, and there are certain kinds of techniques, things to increase processing fluency among the hearer that I think are important. But let's start with attunement. You know, if I am going to, let's say, I am going to pitch a book to a publisher. You know, attunement is, I'm going to understand who's in the room. I want to understand what kinds of work they've done. I want to understand who these people are, what their background is. So that's so that's not a formula. That's not a technique. That's basically I want to know, based on a particular imprint, what is its strategy? What has gone right for them in the past? What has gone wrong for them in the past? In their portfolio of offerings, what is missing? And maybe I can fill that. And so, in publishing and in many kinds of media businesses, people are often chasing the last big thing. And so the question can become, what problem does this publisher have in its publishing portfolio that it doesn't know that it has? And can I surface that? Can I surface that for them? So it's not so much a particular set of formulas or tactics, but a general approach to what I do to prepare. At the same time, buoyancy is, there's some we can go into the tactical stuff in a moment if you want. But in terms of buoyancy is like, if I get rejected from a pitch, which I have gazillions of times,
right?
How do you contend with that? How do you actually derive some learning from that without having it bring you down? And so it's really just a general approach to these things. But once again, it's sort of like with the speeches, a lot of how you pitch things is going to depend on the circumstances you're in. What are you pitching? How well do you know these people? What kind of situation are you in?
Do you have an example of a pitch you've done that just went perfectly for that moment in time, for that audience?
Perfectly, no. I don't think I've ever had a pitch that went perfectly. I'm going to give you an answer to that question, but I'm going to take a step back and say, based on some very interesting research, let's go to first. I'm going to answer that question. I will, because I'll give you one example of something that I thought went really well in some circumstances. I'll come back to that. Okay. So what's the purpose of a pitch? Okay, I have a particular take on what a purpose of a pitch is, and it's based on some research that was done, a decade and a half ago at University of California, Davis, and at Stanford University, where they followed around these movie producers that were, screenwriters who were pitching ideas to producers for shows, for movies. And they were able to actually go with them and record these sessions, these pitch sessions. So we actually have this giant arsenal of data showing what people said in pitches, how they presented the pitches, and then also which ones went forward and which ones did not. And the most important criterion, the best predictor, wasn't any particular kind of pitch. It wasn't, it wasn't a formula. It wasn't saying they pitched with questions and that's how they did it. They pitched with statements. That's how they did it. They use rhymes. They use alliteration. They used a particular storytelling format. What it was that the best pitches had a certain quality. And what they were doing is they were invitations to collaborate. All right. And this is really important. And I got this wrong earlier in my life. So I would go in, maybe pitch my first book, do a whole song and dance about how great it was, then go, sort of like a tap dancer, ba-da! Right. And that's the wrong way to pitch. You have a good pitch not when someone says that's great, but when someone says, oh, that's really good. Have you thought about such and such? Have you thought about this? And so they're participating. They are essentially co-creators in what you're offering. That's what a pitch is all about. A pitch is not an attempt to convert on the spot. In my view, a pitch is an attempt to begin a collaboration. I think that's true in many, many realms. And so I look at a pitch as an invitation rather than an attempt to convert, essentially. So that's one. Now, in terms of pitches that I've worked, I thought I did a really good pitch I wrote a book about the science of timing. I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. I can't remember. And the pitch was essentially the shortened pitch. The shortened pitch was, again, looking at, there's a way to pitch, which is something like, this is, we already have, it's almost like Uber 4. Okay.
Right.
As an Uber 4 pitch. This is not quite that. And so the pitch there, I was interested in the science of timing, and the pitch, the concise pitch was, we have thousands upon thousands of how-to books. I want to write the first when-to book. All right.
Right.
So that's a pretty good pitch. And the pitch worked not because people said, that's great, here's a check. The pitch said, oh, that's really interesting. When you say when, what kind of when are you talking about? Well, I'm talking about daily timing. And they said, well, could it include things like when in your life you do something? I'm like, yeah, that's a good idea. It could be, and so what you have there is you have a way you're bringing them in as a collaborator. And so again, I don't want to belabor this point, but it is less about the slickness of presentation or the glibness of your words than it is about your willingness to issue a legitimate invitation that brings other people in as collaborators to make what you're offering even better.
And I think what you're servicing there as well is sometimes, if not all the time, giving less information is far more powerful than giving more information. A lot of people say, look, I've got an hour to pitch. How am I going to fit all my information in? And actually, you want to be making sure that you're only filling, in my opinion, half the time with information, because you've got to leave that space.
Yeah, you have to leave space. Again, I don't think that there's a hard and fast rule that, only fill half the time, only fill a quarter of the time, only fill 3/4 of the time. I mean, I think it has to be appropriate for the situation. Now, we have some tactical research on this question. So I'll give you an example of this. So let's say that, so let's get we can get very tactical and specific here. based on some research, not based on my intuitions, but based on what scientists have found. So I'll give you an example of this. If I'm making an argument to you, or I'm making a case to you of any kind, whether I'm trying to persuade you on a political point, well, let's forget about politics because that's freighted with other things, but I'm trying to persuade you on a way to pursue a project, or I'm trying to convince you to buy my product or service, right? And I'm going to say, okay, so here are some reasons to do what I want you to do. There is some really interesting research about how many claims you should make in those situations. So one claim is better than zero claims, right? Like if I say to you, oh, I want you to buy my computer system, but I'm not going to give you any reason. Okay, here's one. So one claim is better than zero claims. 2 claims is better than 1 claim. 3 claims is better than 2 claims. 4 claims is worse than 3 claims.
Right.
There is some really good hard evidence about this intuition that some of us have about threes. And the reason for that is that when you're in a persuasive encounter and the other side knows that they're a target of persuasion, that stopping at 3 seems to be the optimal place. It's the Goldilocks about how much information do you give. And so that's one tactical thing on that. There's some other research, again, trying to be useful and practical here on when do you pitch with questions and when do you pitch with statements. And there's some good evidence showing that when the facts are overwhelmingly on your side, all right, when the facts are very clearly on your side, pitching with questions is more effective because you're giving less information and you're allowing the individual to whom you're pitching to come up with his or her own reasons for doing what you want them to do. So again, a lot of it depends, but this is something that, storytellers and writers know when to withhold information and when to deliver information for maximum impact.
Now, one of the things I love about your books is the fact that they're all full of so much research, usually in the field of psychology, which is something that I'm personally very interested in. Putting you on the spot here, but are there any bits of research that you've found that are perhaps even counterintuitive that have really made you think differently, given you a paradigm shift about an idea? Mm-hmm. I'm sure there's loads, but
on this front, I was surprised that strong extroverts are not better at selling than the rest of us. So we tend to think that strong extroverts are the best at sales and persuasion, and the evidence shows that's not true. It doesn't show that strong introverts are better; they're actually worse. What it shows is that the people who are best at selling are ambiverts, people who are somewhat extroverted, somewhat introverted. They're not strongly one way or another. And once you unpack that, it makes some intuitive sense because if you're a strong extrovert, talks too much and listens too little. Maybe is a little bit pushy. Maybe is a little sort of overly gregarious. There's some evidence that gregariousness is inversely correlated with sales success. And so now it also makes sense that strong introverts wouldn't be very good on this because you have to ask for something when you're selling. You have to be social at some level. You have to, deal with other people. But the people who are the best at it seem to be people who are ambiverts because they are, think about the word, they are ambidextrous, they can use their left hand, they can use their right hand. So they know how to push and they know how to hold back. They know how to speak up and they know how to shut up. And those, so that's something where I had an intuition about what was right. And the science came back and said, not quite. That's one. Another one would be, okay, so I was sort of, we've all been told, many of us have been told that, it's important to mimic people, and that's a way to build affinity and understand things, and that to me sounded like total bullshit. And I looked at the research, and it's not.
Right.
There's actually a huge amount of evidence, about the power of mimicry, in part because human beings are natural mimickers. When we talk to other people, we often will mirror their expressions, mirror their gestures, mirror their posture, mirror their language. And that is a way, sort of an embodied way to understand where they're coming from. So that's something else that surprised me. I was surprised. I'll give you another one. I was surprised by, if you had said to me, X years ago, before I looked at this research, so people find rhyming phrases more persuasive than the equivalent phrase that doesn't rhyme. I would say, give me a break. That seems like crap. And yet we have evidence that that's the case. And so there are some things that, where our intuitions about what is going to work and what is not going to work are really off. My own intuitions about what I thought would work and what I thought wouldn't work.
So coming back to the ambiverts and the extroverts to the introverts, I think an extrovert could learn how to tone it down. Do you have advice for more introverted people who are perhaps so shy and so nervous and feel like they're naturally at a disadvantage because of it? What do you tell people?
Well, what I would tell people is really the best part here is that almost all of us are ambiverts. Right. So one of the big problems in the world of how we assess personality is that instruments like, say, Myers-Briggs, which say, oh, I'm an I or an E. First of all, they don't measure introversion, extroversion the way that actual personality psychologists, like scientists, do. And second of all, so they have a different way of evaluating it. But the other thing is that you have to recognize that introversion and extroversion are on a spectrum. It's not binary. And so, if you look at the distribution of introversion and extroversion in the population, a few of us are very strong introverts, but it's a bell curve, not that many. Yeah. A few of us are very strong extroverts, not that many. Most of us are somewhere in the middle. And so even if you are an incredibly, incredibly strong introvert, and what that means is that you do not like ever talking to other people, which I think is rare, but there are people like that. You don't like, you find it terrifying to assert yourself in any situation. That is, a lot of having, any amount of stimulus beyond a modest amount is overwhelming to you. If you are that very strong introvert, then I would say, don't do this. Don't go into sales. I mean that very seriously.
Yeah.
Don't do that. But most of us aren't that. Most of us aren't that extreme. Most of us are people like me who I test more introverted than extroverted. Big freaking surprise. I became a writer. But, and so what you can move a little bit more to the center by just doing things that are modest. So for instance, asking people open-ended questions. All right. Not formulaic questions, but open-ended questions. What's the best part about your job? Rather than how you doing? What's the best part about your job? What excites you about your job? What's bringing you down about your job? Those kinds of things. Asking people open-ended questions. One of the things we also see in a whole range of research, which should be heartening for introverts, is that there's a lot of introverts who don't like small talk, so-called small talk. Is that most people don't like small talk, that people are actually much more willing to engage in deep talk, all of us, than we give them credit for. And so open-ended questions, moving from small talk to deep talk. And also if you're really, just starting small, and doing the kind of things every once in a while, pushing yourself a little bit past your discomfort in the way that extroverts would do. I mean, I'll give you an example of my own life about something that I might do. So, for instance, I truly never talk to anybody who's sitting next to me on an airplane or a bus or a train.
Right.
Never. I would never talk to them. And yet there are people out there who will sit there and they'll talk to me unbidden, and I'm like, what the heck? And I realize there's actually an advantage to doing that. Not all the time, but if you're a super introverted and you're riding on a bus or a train or a plane, strike up a conversation with the person next to you 1 out of 10 times. Not every time, 1 out of 10 times. And you'll begin to push yourself past that. So, but again, I think the main thing to think about is that most of us have the native personality to be okay at sales. Because again, if you go back to, I'm putting my hands in the shit because it's a bell curve. Most of us are within that, the distribution that says we're going to be all right. People like me might be more introverted than extroverted. Other people might be more extroverted than introverted, but most of us are, more or less ambiverts.
So what about a more common topic then? And let me ask you the question first. And I assume the answer is yes, but do you get nervous when you have to? I mean, sometimes you present to huge crowds, right? And
Yeah,
how do you deal with it?
great question. Do I get nervous? Yeah, I mean, yes and no.
Okay.
I think I do get nervous. My response but I've sort of trained myself to respond to that nervousness is a signal.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you look at nervousness not as something that is good or bad, not as something that is, oh my God, I'm nervous, that's debilitating. But as a signal. But it's basically saying, you know what? There's some stakes here. There's something at stake in what I'm doing here. So my response, and you feel that. There's no question about it. It's embodied, and I feel that all the time. The question then becomes, what's your response to the nervousness? And the response to the nervousness, so you can do two things. You can ignore it, saying, nope, I'm going to pretend this doesn't exist. Bad idea. You can say, oh my God, I'm nervous, and then bring yourself into a downward spiral about that. That's a worse idea. Or you can say, wow, it's like this nervousness is like a notification on my phone. Beep, beep. It's telling me something. What it's telling me is like, whoa, remember, there's something at stake here. So how do you respond to that? For me, I respond to that by going in my head and saying, okay, I got to make sure, let's say I'm pitching something. I'm outside the door. Pitching something, getting ready to pitch, and I'm nervous about that. What I will do is I will maybe take a breath and then rehearse the three things that I need to mention there. You can also think about, well, I've been in this situation before and it's gone fine. So remember those situations. What did I do in those situations? There's some very interesting research in what's called in our self-talk in these situations. So you can say, you can pump yourself up and say, you got this, you're great. And there's some advantage in that. My favorite technique is what's called interrogative self-talk, where you ask yourself a question and you essentially say, can you do this? And if so, how? And rather than it's not undercutting or really doubting your abilities. It's basically saying, if I ask a question, then I have to respond in some ways. And so, I can do this. I've done this before. I pitched a book before. Yeah, I can do this because going back to our earlier conversation, I know who the people are in the room. And I know that this one person over here is going to be very skeptical of this idea. And so I have a way to respond to her question when it inevitably comes up. Can I do this? Yes. The last time I did this, I talked too much and listened too little. So I got to make sure I put the brakes on a little bit and listen. So what am I doing? I'm taking that nervousness and using it as a signal to prepare, to rehearse, to respond. And so I think that's so. A lot of us get nervous. The question is, what do you do with it? And I think that people who don't get a little nervous are probably doing it wrong. Because they're overconfident, perhaps, or they don't realize that there's something at stake.
So, switching topics altogether, although you did mention this earlier, it'd be remiss of me in this day and age not to ask you your thoughts on how we could, should, or shouldn't be using AI in the world of sales, presenting, pitching, speech writing in general. What are your overarching views on it?
I look at it as another tool. I'm not alarmed that it's going to destroy, lots and lots of jobs. I think it's going to be a tool like search engine was a tool, like email was a tool, like the smartphone was a tool. It's going to be a tool that a lot of people are using, and it might be able to help us do our work. Might be able to help us do our work better. I think it's going to be very difficult to have a good speech on using one of the large language models. I think it's possible that but you can use it as a thought starter. You can say, I have to give a speech about X, Y, or Z, and here are some points that I want to hit. Can you give me a preliminary outline? and you maybe look at their outline. What I have found is that AI is good for unblocking things like that.
Yeah.
So I used it for something. I'm trying to think of something. I used it for something today where I was trying to give me 10 ideas for how to talk about this particular topic.
Right.
And essentially, I'm trying to remember. Yeah. And it's like they gave me 10 ideas and 9 of them were awful.
Right.
Just execrable. But one of them was like somewhat interesting and it got me unstuck. The way I look at when I was a speechwriter 100 years ago, during one of my jobs, I worked in a very, very large office with 2 other speechwriters. And inevitably what we would do is we would turn to each other and shout questions. Hey, what's a non-cliche way of saying on the firing line? And you just like shout over there, and someone would give you an example or something like that. And I sort of think it was like another colleague in the room who you can shout stuff at. And if I shout over to somebody in the other room and they give me an idea and it sucks, I'm not going to use it. But it just, the act of asking for it and getting something can often unblock you.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And so, you're not worried it's going to have a big impact, but do you think in terms of taking away jobs though, but could you see the world being a different place in 10 years because of it, considering how much it's changed in the last kind of 2 or 3?
I mean, I think if there is artificial general intelligence, then I think it does change. It does change the world. Maybe not as dramatically and immediately as people might think. But let's put it another way. I mean, we've seen this movie before. I mean, did social media change the world? Yeah, I think so. I think it changed how we live. Maybe not dramatically, but it had a big effect. I think that search engines have changed the way we live. And so if you go back, say 20 years, would it's almost unimaginable to think that at some point you didn't have a search engine, that it's almost unimaginable to think that you didn't have text messages and things like, those kinds of things. And so I think AI will be somewhat, it's just another tool. It's another very, very powerful tool. Artificial general intelligence is a big deal. And if it's widespread, I think that does change things. But again, a lot.
Yeah.
I'm not that. I don't. It's an interesting question. Would someone from 50 years ago? So what is 50 years ago? 50 years ago is 1975. Okay, so if you were to take somebody from 1975 and transport them into my office, I think they'd be surprised by a few things. I think they'd be surprised by this conversation we're having right now, where we can see each other. I think they'd be surprised by search engines. I think they'd be surprised by my mobile phone. But I think a lot of other stuff would be completely recognizable. Like my office has
books.
I got books. I got a desk. I have pencil and paper. There's an automobile over there. So I just feel like AI is going to march in the same tradition as things that I've been mentioning before. Search engines, email, the computer itself, the internet itself, which have been big changes, but they haven't made the world completely unrecognizable to someone 10 years prior, 20 years prior, 30 years prior.
So we got 5 minutes left. I want to be respectful of your time. Would you rather have a question on motivation or regret?
Regret, especially at the end.
Do you regret coming on this show? So what I'm interested in is perhaps something that you regret, that you've learned something so huge that the lesson from it has changed your life.
I think so. So I have some regrets about earlier in my life about kindness. I don't think I was ever a bully, but there were many situations when I was younger where I saw people not being treated right, being mistreated, not being treated well. I wasn't necessarily perpetrating that, but I saw it and I knew it was wrong and I didn't do anything. And it bugs me even to this day. And so the question then becomes, like we were talking about before, with regret or, and, this like nervousness, like any kind of dangerous negative emotion, is what do you do with it? And so I can take that regret about deficits of kindness and say, I'm a terrible person. I'm the worst person in the world. Bad idea. I can put my fingers in my ears and say it doesn't matter because it was in the past. That's a bad idea too. What I could also be doing is saying, whoa, that's actually a pretty strong signal. I don't remember what I had for lunch today. I don't remember what clothes I wore yesterday. And yet there's something that I did or didn't do 30 years ago, 40 years ago that I still remember today and it bugs me. That's a pretty strong signal, guys. And so I think what the signal for me is that I might value kindness more than I consciously realize. And I don't want to be in a situation in the future where I'm reflecting on my life and saying, oh, I was sort of an ass. I wasn't like good enough person. And so now I'll make different decisions, whether it's, speaking up if somebody is being mistreated, trying to do that. Even something more mundane, if I'm in a social situation and sometimes you see a person who's marooned all by him or herself, I would make an effort to bring that person. I'll make an effort to bring that person in. That's not something that I would have done, but for that, that feeling, that spirit of regret, using it as a signal, and then not wanting to feel it again.
Is there a specific book that you'd recommend to someone other than your own? Oh, well, actually, I recommend your own as well, but I'll be listing all of them in the show notes anyway. But someone who's starting out age, 18, 19, interested in getting into the big world of sales and pitching.
I would recommend Influence by Robert Cialdini as an absolutely essential book before any of mine. So that would be one. I think that some of the books written by the whole suite of books written by the Heath brothers, Chip Heath and Dan Heath, are absolutely worth reading. There is a really great, more recent book by Jonah Berger at the University of Pennsylvania called Magic Words, which I really, really liked. So those would be three off the top of my head that I think would be super valuable for anybody just starting out.
So here's an interesting question. I haven't asked any of my guests ever this question, but the question I get asked is, how do you, Danny, get these people on your show? So tell me why you came on. Tell me candidly, how was my pitch? Why did you say yes?
That's a great question. I'll give you two reasons. One of them is that you were. I'll give you three reasons. One of them was that you were. Well, maybe one of them is the same reason, but you were. I think there's a magic to being persistent and polite at the same time, and a lot of people haven't balanced that. So I think you did a great job of balancing that, and also you knew what some of the work that I had done, and that came very clear in the pitch. So it wasn't like, you were desperate for a guest and, and any kind of guest. So the combination of that sort of like, we need a word for someone who is politely persistent. There needs to be it's probably a German word for that combines the two. and so it was a combination of the politeness and the persistent in a very polite way. And also just making it very clear, but also not in an aggressive way, that you knew that you wanted me on not just to fill a spot, but because you knew some of the stuff that I had worked on.
So in a nutshell, knowing the audience and sending 700 emails.
Yes. 700 polite emails.
Exactly. Right. Can I get a final thought from you? A message to anyone who thinks, how do I do this pitching stuff? Or even, it could be about anything. What do you want to tell people? Something important?
Well, I want to go back to the idea that most of us are ambiverts. And so don't fall for the myth that extroverts are sales stars, that the people who are real sales stars are ambiverts. And most of us are ambiverts. So you really do have the native abilities to do this. Also, selling isn't necessarily what you think it is from watching television. It isn't all about talking. It's a lot about listening. It's a lot about finding problems. It's a lot about being an expert. So I think that's really important. And the other thing is that, if you're trying to do something new, you don't have to do it all at once. One thing where I've changed my mind is I used to be a big adherent of big, hot, hairy, audacious goals. And now I'm a much fiercer proponent of small wins. Because I really think that's how we change and that's how the world changes. Small wins that cascade to small wins that cascade to more small wins. So those would be 3 pieces of advice for people just starting out.
Brilliant. Daniel, thank you so much for your time. It's been my absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Good stuff. You have been listening to Pitch Masters with me, your host, Danny Fontaine. You can find me on social media, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Just search for Danny Fontaine or Pitch Guy for exclusive clips from behind the scenes and from the show. You can also find where to order my book, Pitch: How to Captivate and Convince Any Audience on the Planet, by searching on Google or visiting pitchguy.co.uk, where you'll also find additional resources and a newsletter to sign up to for exclusive content. As always, thank you so much for listening. Your support means absolutely everything to me. And feel free to reach out to me via my website as well. I absolutely love to hear great stories about incredible pitches. So, until next time, catch you later.